God is always hunting after each of us. He desires our companionship and provides the grace to follow his will. However, conversion and perseverance are not easy. Today's guest discusses his transformation to God from being a negative and bitter police officer, one who was also suffering from multiple addictions and oppressed by the devil. But he held fast. He did the harder thing, and his witness and wisdom today speak of God's love for each of us men. So stay with us. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. We are so blessed that you have decided to join us. If this is your first time, please click that subscribe button wherever you are. If you're on YouTube, click that bell button so that you can get notified each time one of these come out. We've got a great guest today, Jordan Burke. I'm looking forward to introducing him. But before we get there, if you're looking to support The Catholic Gentleman, we have launched The Catholic Gentleman Plus. Sam and I are so excited. For years, we have been hearing men's cry that they just need a little bit more help. They need a little bit more strategy. They need a little bit more guidance in their life. And what could be better but creating a membership program for men that can answer these questions and answer these needs. And so that's what Sam and I have done. Each month, we're coming out with new themes. We're coming out with new topics. We have guest experts coming on every single month. It is affordable. We've got, ebooks that are coming out every single month and a lot more things that are happening. So we are very excited to present that. Head over to Catholic Gentleman Plus or click on the link in the show notes to see more. So as I mentioned, I'm excited to introduce our guest today, Jordan Burke. So after a little over a half a decade of protecting and serving his community as a police officer, Jordan Burke traded in his badge and his gun for a Bible and a rosary. Falling deeply in love with the church and her teachings, praise be to God, as Sam and I are as well, he dove headfirst into the writings of the saints and all aspects of the spiritual theology and hasn't stopped learning since. So we have Jordan on today because he's a lover of truth. He is a soldier in Christ. He is a gentleman extraordinaire. And he runs a group with a motto, do the harder thing. And that's how I came across him on his website. I do know his father. Actually, I've met his father, but I didn't connect the dots until a little bit after following you on Instagram, as humorous as that is. So he also has spends time farming, and he has a beautiful baby girl and lives with them. Where are you guys living? What state?
So the retreat center is in Montgomery, Alabama.
Awesome. Montgomery, Alabama. So anyways, Jordan, so grateful for you joining us today. You've got quite a story and something that I know all our listeners, myself included, want to hear. So I'd love to hear, back from the beginning when you weren't Catholic, right? And you were just searching.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you having me on. And it's funny you mentioned this because we have a priest visiting with us, and he just wanted to hear my story. And I thought, man, I haven't told my story in so long. I'm forgetting so many pieces. So he got the dry run. So hopefully this one is a little bit more cohesive. But I come from a really rough childhood, as I think a lot of people do in some way, some form or fashion, in our modern time, unfortunately. But my mother was a severe alcoholic and was very abusive, to the point where there's a significant portion of my childhood that is repressed memories. And I've worked with varying counselors and therapists and professionals in that area. And but that's kind of a response to the trauma, right? So interestingly, even through that, I had an idea of God, probably because my dad, excuse me, we were kind of bouncing around. He wasn't Catholic at the time. He hadn't converted yet. And so we had gone to the Anglican church. He was in Anglican seminary for a period of time after they had split. Everywhere. We were all over the place. Of course, Protestant churches. I remember one of the few memories I have was the typical Protestant church in a school gym. Right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to play on the rock wall in the back. I had no interest in anything that was going on at the time. So I had an idea of God, but I didn't have a relationship with God by any means. And so, things got in my childhood pretty bad. My parents had gotten divorced. He moved not too far away. I'd ride my bike on the side of the highway, try to go see him. just because I had that yearning to be with my father, because good fathers are so necessary, as I'm sure all of us here know and everyone listening knows. And it got to the point where I got in trouble with the law. I like to say I was interviewed by a detective. My dad likes to say I was arrested. I don't really remember the exact details, but it's one of those two, a combination of those two. And it was harmless. It was a stupid choice, wrong place, wrong time sort of situation. But it was eye-opening, and it caused a spiral event to where I had a fight with my mom, and I was I remember being in the basement of my house, and I just prayed to God, I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to be here anymore. The suffering, the scrounging for change to go buy candy from the store, because that's the thing that I could afford to eat. This, having meals donated by local churches, Christmas presents donated by local churches. And I'm not degrading or downing any of that. Thank God that those things exist. I wouldn't have had any food. But the overall situation and the struggle and the pain and the abuse and all these other things, I just prayed, Lord, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to kill myself. But if you want to take me, that'd be great. So that was what was on my heart. And it resulted in me calling my dad. And he had converted by this time. He had remarried by this time. He had the annulment process was super easy because he wasn't married in the church, all those sorts of things. And they drove a couple hours to come pick me up. And that kind of put me on this pathway, right? So my dad converts. Now I'm out of this bad situation, but I'm carrying all of this baggage with me. I'm carrying these wounds that have not healed. I'm carrying all these different issues that I've had. I mean, I tell people I have no doubt, and we'll probably get into this, I have no doubt that I was oppressed, very heavily oppressed spiritually. And so I was very full of rage and anger, and these wounds were just festering. And in the midst of that, I convert. So I'm watching what my dad is doing, and I've always been very intellectually driven. And so I'm reading, okay, well, this is what the Episcopalians say. This is what, the Anglicans say. This is what, who cares, name it, right? But then I stumble across apostolic succession, and I thought, this makes perfect sense. So I thought this is brilliant. I mean, you're telling me that I can go to a priest, and in the midst of they can trace back to one of the disciples. It's like, that's amazing. So it was a very intellectual conversion, but it was a conversion, and praise God for it, because that planted the seeds for what grew later on. So fast forward quite a bit of time, and all through these wounds and different things like that, I become a police officer. I was going to go into the military. That didn't work out. Become a police officer, and I spend my formative years on the streets of Birmingham, right? And at the time, I don't know if it still is, but at the time it was ranked one of the top 10 most dangerous cities in the nation. I was shot at multiple times, fights and things like that. I was a member of the quick response team. So if there was an active shooter call or anything like that, I was a part of that team that would go in and respond.
If I could, what inspired you to go into become a police officer? I missed that.
Here's what's funny about that. I don't even remember applying. I legitimately don't. I've always had a sense of justice, right? Now, I think at the time it was a very disordered understanding of justice, but I did know right from wrong, and I did want to help people. And that seemed like the pathway to make that work the most. And what's interesting is, before that, I was working in retail, but I had the ability to kind of climb the ladder, so to speak. Just a hard worker, helping make things more functional, and manager saw that and said, awesome, I want to make you a manager of this store. Like, okay, great. So I could have probably followed that path, but I was yearning for something more. So when the letter came, like I said, I don't remember applying, but I guess I did. But when the letter came to say, hey, come try out, you need to do the physical assessment and all that. I went through it, and I'm just like, okay, well, this is the path. We're going to do this. And what's fascinating is, even though I had this intellectual understanding of the faith, and I had not owned it, I was not living it. I was going to mass, but I just wasn't living it. It was very culturally Catholic. I think would be giving myself too much credit in this, if that kind of describes it. I just wasn't mentally there. but I remember praying Hail Marys in formation, because they act like drill sergeants. You line them up, and the jail. And what's really funny is the police academy. I don't know if it's still there, but the jail is right behind it. So we'd go for formation in the morning, and you'd have people in the jail screaming at you from the windows. That's your information, and you can't respond, and the instructors are getting in your face, and it's all for a purpose, of course. But I just remembered staring at one chain link on the fence and just praying Hail Mary over and over again, and that's what got me through.
Wow.
So it's fascinating, these little threads, right, that go through the story. So I go in, I believe at 20, I graduate the academy, and I become a full-fledged officer at age 21. And then those formative years, those early 20s, were spent on the streets dealing with what I was dealing with. My first, and as perspective or context rather, my first week I worked a homicide every single day, sometimes multiples a day. And so it was trial by fire in a big way. And and I think, unfortunately, there's not a lot of help for guys in that situation to help them to understand what they're seeing and going through. Having to watch somebody die is really hard. Knowing that there's nothing you can do, and you're just standing there. It's a feeling of helplessness, but there's nothing to help guys work through that. So what happens is, I have this level of rage that already existed, and this level of wounds that already existed. And it just, what I was experiencing, just, maybe it's a cup, right? Just filled that cup, just kept filling it until it started overflowing. And I became hyper negative. I was seeing a lot of injustice. I was seeing a lot of corruption and trying to change it, and getting blacklisted because of it, being refused positions that I had all of the resume filled out for, what it should have been a shoe-in sort of a thing. But because I was outspoken, and granted, I guarantee you I didn't go about it the right way. I didn't have the prudence at the time, so that's on me. But and it was just not a good situation. So those things build up. And during this, I skipped over an important part, and I apologize. But when I was young, in the midst of the abuse, I stumbled on pornography that became an issue throughout my entire life. But in the midst of this is when it really started becoming a hold. And then you combine horrific nightmares that I had every single night, literally every single night, horrific nightmares without fail. So I thought, okay, well, if I drink enough, I can get to sleep. And this is how ridiculous it is. I had it down to a science. I knew that if I stopped at the corner store on the way home and talked to my buddy who worked there, and he was a really nice guy, an immigrant who was telling me what cars he was working on, and he just got his passport, just became like that. I enjoyed that. But if I got this drink, and this drink, it's enough to get me out and to sleep, but it's not enough to cause any problems the next morning, right? But it still causes a problem. We know that physiologically. So I'm not getting deep sleep. And so this cycle of drinking and pornography and anger, and drinking and pornography and, all these other things in the midst of serial relationships, because I was trying to, in a way that I believe so many of us do with our varying wounds. For me, I was not given the love of a mother that I needed, or affection in that way. And I didn't know this at the time. It took much therapy and counseling and things like that to discover this. But I was seeking that love, that true love, like Mary gives to us. But I was seeking that in relationships. So now I'm adding serial relationships, just sin on top of sin, in the midst of all this. I end up getting married. I completely destroy that. It was very short. It was a year or less. My ex-wife got pregnant. We have a beautiful little girl, but my sin at that point broke. We both brought our kindling to the marriage, so to speak. We both brought our wounds, because wounded people attract wounded people, of course. And that's not anything about her. It's just the reality of the world we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And so we both brought our kindling, but my sin is what lit the fire, right? And everything went up in smoke. So there was a certain point where I just completely broke down, completely broke down. I had fallen away from the church at this point. I was going to her Protestant church, and I was barely going through the motions. I was barely surviving. I end up leaving policing because I can't handle it anymore. And I'm thinking, man, if I get killed, because I went in before Ferguson. So, politically, we know how it is now. When everything was really on fire then,
Yeah.
it's like, if I die, I cannot do this and leave my daughter without a father. I can't do that. So I leave policing. And I even had a company where I was teaching people how to shoot defensive tactics and things like close that down, all that kind of stuff. But so everything is just breaking down. And I come to this point and I'm just crying out, like, God, I don't know what it is. I don't know what needs to happen. Something needs to give. Something needs to give. So I'm at church, their Protestant church one day, and I'm sitting there and I'm just kind of like observing. And I have the thought, and this is interesting for more context, I was mad at what I thought the church was, the Catholic Church. I was mad.
Yeah. But
I had the thought, I really miss the Eucharist. And it was so profound that even in the depth of my my sickness and my stupidity, quite frankly, that it broke through. And I thought, why would I think that? I'm mad at the church. Right. I would never do that. But it broke through enough where God kind of gave me this thread and started pulling me in the right direction. So in the midst of this, I'd already kind of dabbled with counseling and things like that. And some things were starting to break free. And maybe that was the initial grace that God needed to kind of, not that he needs grace, but you know what I mean? Our cooperation with his grace that he needed to kind of, to poke me, to bring him back. And I dove in, because I was just completely broken. My ex-wife had left. She had taken my daughter with her. And, I'm in this empty house by myself. And, I can't stand who I've become and all these other different things. So I just dive in. I'm like, all right, Lord, if you're calling me, I'm going all in. This is what's going to happen. Somehow I had Father Ripperger's deliverance prayers for the laity.
Wow.
I don't know how. Probably my folks. I found it on one of my shelves. So I'm looking through that and I'm like, okay, this is amazing. I go to an intensive, it was a 4-day therapy. I wouldn't call it a retreat, but we walk in and we're lined up and the guys say, you need to understand that what you're about to experience is 100 hours of intensive therapy and we're going to jam into 4 days. So buckle up. So that's sort of a level of thing, because I'm the kind of guy, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it all out. I'm going to give you everything that I have. And that kind of began the journey. Now, the real turning point. So all these things are starting to move. This stone facade is starting to kind of break and crumble slowly. But my parents didn't quite know everything that was going on. And I knew that because at this time now I had transitioned from one job that I was doing to working for them. So I'm working for a Catholic organization, but I had fallen away from the church and I was struggling and I was coming back, but I knew that I had to be honest with them and honor them. And so I called them up and I said, hey, we need to talk. And so I met them at the church of the shrine of the Most Blessed Sacrament. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's absolutely incredible. Yeah. Mother Angelica is there. It's amazing. So we meet in a room off of the main church. And I remember purposefully sitting in a chair where they couldn't sit next to me. There's a table in between us. I'm trying to create a little bit of distance because I don't know what my dad's going to do. He's never been violent, but I'm like, if he ever is going to be violent, it might be this. So I'm in this completely wounded state, and I had a plan, and I was hoping that like me showing them that I've been making effort and I'm trying would be in my favor a little bit, And so I sit them down and I begin to weep and uncontrollably, and I tell them everything. I mean, everything. I'm talking down to the detail, everything. And so Stephanie, my stepmom, she's really my mom. She comes in, she sits on the table and she puts her hand out. And I just knew I needed to put my hand in hers. So I put my hand in her hand. And she said, I'm so sorry for your suffering. And in that moment, I experienced the love that I'd been searching for so long, you know, and in a moment that I certainly didn't deserve it, you know, like this is the stuff I was doing in your house. This is what I've done. This is, you know, one of the reasons why you can't see your granddaughter right now is because of my own sin and, you know, these different things. And it was just, and it wasn't, there was no excusing anything that I did, but it was also a recognizing that, yeah, you went to the pigs, you're eating from the trough, and that sucks. And I love you, and I don't want you to experience that. But that moment was so profound that I believe it was in that moment that the oppression was lifted through that act of pure love and grace. And I say that because as I'm driving away from the shrine, I remember looking up at the sky and thinking, I have never seen the clouds so clearly. Like they're crisp. I've never seen the sky so blue. And then I'm thinking, I've never been able to really hear my thoughts like this. Like everything is so clear. And that's when the stone facade fell. And I continued to dive and I continued to push and I continued to learn. And in the midst of that experience, tremendous healing, you know, JP2's Dr. Bob Schucht's Healing the Whole Person was a part of that later on, but that was a huge part of that as well. It helped me understand some more. So I dove in deep and I thought, okay, well, I've been doing really well with this pornography thing by the grace of God, but I hate having to white knuckle things. There's got to be something we can do here. And so I end up talking to the CSATs, the certified sex addiction therapist that I had talked to at that intensive retreat, which by the way, this is interesting. I'll back up a little bit. One of them sits down with me and he says, Jordan, you understand you're not addicted to pornography, right? And I thought, what? I'm here because I have an issue that's affected my life. What do you mean? And he goes, no. You're addicted to affection. And this is merely a coping mechanism. And even having that mindset shift, well, and he did say, you know, obviously you don't meet the clinical criteria for clinical addiction. So there is that. So praise God for that. But that mindset shift, right? And so I'm talking to them and I'm pulling all these resources that I've found and I've learned, and I'm diving into neuroscience and psychology and neurochemistry and understanding dopamine and serotonin and how, you know, pornography affects the brain, the human brain, to a certain degree, like heroin does. You're getting similar hits of dopamine and serotonin and things like this, and you know, all of that. And so I end up making a system because there's stuff out there, and there's a lot of stuff out there, but I felt like it didn't touch on the key factor, which is what we know, which is the beauty of the faith. Mm-hmm. So combining those two things, that's what really set me free. And then God started putting people in my life, and they were out of the blue, and they were saying, I'm really struggling with pornography. And I'm like, hey, here's what I'm doing. Maybe it will help. It helps them. And eventually I create Do the Harder Thing, which was kind of a more of a blog. And then it morphed into talking more about the pornography side and helping people. And then now for the past year and a half, I think, or maybe 2 years, God kind of brought me to this place where he said, okay, awesome. You did what I wanted you to do. You did what I asked. Now I need you to go into another direction. And that's when the deep dive, and there'd been a lot of signposts along the way that this was coming. St. Gemma being one of them. Yeah. So this had been coming for years. But he said, okay, but I really need you to do it now. And I have kind of a Jonah complex where even to this day, God says, I need you to do something. And I'm like, maybe the inside of the whale might be a little bit better. And I still haven't learned yet. I still struggle with that. So now anyway, the past year and a half, 2 years have been diving into spiritual warfare, demonology, angelology, and taking these topics that are talked about, but really breaking it down into brass tacks and removing the veil, removing any sort of, ideally, God willing, any sort of fear in the topic, any sort of misunderstanding, and just saying, listen, God is a great God. Jesus is King. He's provided you with everything that you need in the church and its graces to overcome whatever comes your way. This is how it's done, you know? Amen. And so that's kind of the main focus now. But yeah, that's the story in a very truncated version.
Wow. Wow. I'm really grateful. It's quite a story and something that gives us plenty of next avenues for us to dive into. So there's no shortage of things we could discuss. But Sam, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, well, I mean, I love conversion stories, and yours is a particularly powerful one. So thank you for sharing that. It's absolutely incredible what God did in your life, and how what He's still doing, and still drawing you further on and deeper in the faith. I just want to point out, but I mean, I have a question, but I do want to point out a couple of threads or themes that you mentioned. And one is that powerful anger. And anger is so tied to justice. It's so tied to a sense of injustice, really. And like you felt that for so long, and that kind of led you to want to set things right and be a police officer. But then that wasn't quite what you were looking for.
Right.
That it wasn't quite the manifestation of that you were looking for in your life. But that anger and justice were so tied together, but they were protecting that vulnerability underneath. But what I love is that moment you talk about where you experienced mercy. It's like it wasn't denying what happened. There was justice in saying like this wasn't right. And yet, as our theologians tell us, like mercy goes beyond justice. It's not like contrary to it. It goes further than it. And it's like, even though you did all of these things, we're not denying that, I still release you. And it's that powerful experience of mercy, that it's kind of captured in the story of the prodigal son, where he has no expectations of being welcomed back into the family or anything like that. It's just like, I'm here, punish me if you need to. I'm just trying to survive here. And then it's like, no, I'm actually going to release you from your debt and in fact celebrate you and embrace you with love. And I just like when we talk about mercy so often in the church, it tends to be like, we're quoting John Paul II or St. Faustina or something, and it can be something very abstract. And you talked about how like your journey to begin with was like very intellectual. But I would love to hear you expand on just like what that experience of mercy, why that was so transformative beyond like any idea of mercy that you could read in the catechism or in a textbook, or like how did that experience like just transform your heart just in a personal way?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think in a lot of ways it goes back to that old idiom that talk is cheap, right? You can intellectually know all these things, but what I often reference, or I shouldn't say often reference, I've been thinking a lot about Jesus calling the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. So they had the appearance of, everything is put together, they know the law, they know all these different things, but on the inside they're dead and they're rotting. So what do their words mean? Not much. It's a facade. So in that moment of mercy for me, it was a practical and even physical experience that exemplified even something like vulnerability, where I had put myself physically away from them. I had to choose to give her my hand in that moment of vulnerability. I didn't know what she was going to do. There's no telling, but in that act of mercy, I think it's one thing, we do have to say the words, right? Like when we talk about forgiveness, especially when the exorcists talk about forgiveness and breaking ties, you have to choose to forgive, even if you don't feel it. So there is power there in saying it. But there is also power in physically exemplifying it. You know what I mean? It's that hug, it's that bringing in, it's that touch, it's that living out your faith in an action that's undeniable because you're doing it. It's physically present. It's there. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, no, I think that's incredibly powerful and something that is good to carry as a witness to all of us. And so I really appreciate you sharing all of those intricacies. And I actually want to turn a little bit, because you brought it up a couple times with demons and say spiritual combat or spiritual warfare. And in our culture today, there's a very, cinematic sort of understanding and maybe an inappropriate curiosity with so much of it. So I want to know, when hearing your story, it kind of seemed like Satan had grabbed a hold of you. You were basically checked off on the list of we got this one. And when you decided to push back, when you decided to open your heart to mercy, when you were able to cooperate with grace or hear the voice of God in these moments, how were you aware of it, and what sort of spiritual attacks started coming up? And then again, how were you guided to continue on the path? Or was it just that you had reached the bottom and you didn't like it down there, and it didn't matter what happened? You said you put yourself full force into everything. You were going to get out no matter what. I'd love to hear just a little bit more about that, the spiritual side of your journey.
Yeah. So being at the bottom, what you just said, that is a part of it, but it's important to note that when I started coming back, thank God I have the parents that I do. He's written books on these different things, and if I have a question about anything, it's like, yeah, read this or read this. So I started understanding mental prayer, and I basically, one of the things I left out, but in the midst of everything going on, I was by myself for about a year, and I call it kind of my hermitage year, where I had no friends. All my family was 3 hours away. I was just trying to see my daughter as often as I could. I was going to work, I was going to the gym, and that was about it. And inside of that, I was learning to pray. And I was learning to hear the voice of God, using Lectio Divina, utilizing mental prayer. I set up a prayer space. It's because it's so important to prime yourself, because your body is your enemy. It's going to do everything to distract you, right? Setting up a prayer area on the edge of my bed. It was tiny. It was simple, with some candles to kind of set the ambiance, to like help me focus, with a beautiful crucifix, some icons, things of that nature. Probably some of the stuff behind me. That I'm sure some of that was from that same space. And sitting with the Gospels and praying and trying to learn, okay, God, I want to know you. I want to know your voice. One of the things that I still think about, I always keep it in the forefront of my mind. I ask myself in certain situations, and I ask my friends this a lot too, they're trying to decide on something. I said, okay, well, let's say you go and stand in front of Jesus tomorrow. What do you have to do in this circumstance? Or what do you think you need to do in order for him to say, well done, my good and faithful servant? Or is he going to say, I never knew you? Well, for those who study the Greek, right, not to get into the intellectual part of it, because I'm not that intellectual for the record, but the Greek in that sense, knew, is the same Greek used for Adam knew Eve. So Jesus is saying, I never knew you. What is he saying? I was never intimate with you, right? It's like the spousal union with us in Christ. Well, how do you know your spouse? You talk to them, right? And hopefully you talk to them every day. And you don't just talk, but you listen. And that's what mental prayer is. It's Lectio Divina. So in that year, I'm spending time in the gospel, and I'm just trying to learn God, and I'm asking him questions. And I'm not saying that I had like locutions and, I heard the voice of God and these sorts of things, but, you read it and thank God there's something like the Cantia, where you have early church fathers that you can go back to and get more context. Like, beautiful, right? It's free. You can get it on your phone for free.
I know.
Right. And in the midst of that, I learned his voice, and that helped guide me moving forward. Now, and that provided a tremendous amount of strength and guidance as to what he wanted me to do. Like, I didn't do the harder thing on a whim. I actually didn't want to start it at all. I had no desire to start it. But God had made it very clear through normal means and measures. That's what he wanted me to do. So, but on the flip side of that coin, the spiritual battles, my goodness, not just the cross of the continued damage that I had caused, not being able to see my daughter, which is a cross in and of itself, but there were, legitimate, whether it was still struggling, like you think you're okay, and then the temptation comes up. I gave a talk at George Mason University, and they said, "What's the most extreme thing you've ever done to make sure that you don't fall?" I told him, I said, I broke an iPad over my knee. There's one night where I was so tempted, and I was just like, I can't do this. And I smashed it over my knee. And I joked and I said, you have a bed covered full of slivers of glass. And you're not gonna do anything. You're not gonna sleep, but you're not gonna do anything else either.
Absolutely.
So the normative means of demonic interaction, which is temptation. That's what they do all the time, right? Whether we recognize it or not. But then there was also the kind of more extraordinary means, higher levels of temptation. As crazy as it is, I was at a healing conference, and I had a beautiful young woman who literally threw herself at me. And I was like, what is this? Because I've been so distant from everything for so long that it was shocking. And by the grace of God, I recognized, okay, this has to be a temptation. This doesn't make sense. This is the only thing that it could be. And I wasn't as well versed then, and knowing what I know now, it was 100% a temptation. And avoiding that, and then to the more extreme things, to where we were talking about Saint Gemma before we started this. I decided to do a novena to her when I had found out about her and fell in love with her. And this is probably the only time that I can remember. I certainly haven't had anything like this since that I can recall. This one is just very vivid in my mind. And I do not believe that it's common. So if anyone listens to this and gets freaked out, I do. God permits what he permits. And I think he permitted this for me for a particular purpose. So don't get freaked out for these sorts of things. But I start to pray her novena the very first night. And I'm laying in my bed. And because I'm 20-something-year-old bachelor, my mattress is on the floor, of course, right?
Yeah,
very classy.
That's right.
And
the gentleman lifestyle.
right. And then I have my little bedside table right here. And so I'm like in this corner, and I feel this, I'm asleep, but I wake up and I feel this dark presence over me, as if it's kneeling next to my bed and leaning over me. And I think I opened my eyes. I don't really know. It was a weird, like, sort of dream state almost, but it was very, very real. But I knew it was a female. I don't want to say essence because it sounds new agey, but like there was something there. And it leaned over me, got into my face, and screamed.
Wow.
And I'm laying there like, and something in the midst of that was like, this is because you started the novena to Saint Gemma. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to pray it even harder.
Yeah.
And so I did the St. Michael prayer, and I rolled over, and I was fine. And I never had anything happen like that since. Not to say that I haven't been places where, there obviously we've all experienced like, there's something off here.
For sure.
But other than that was kind of the most extreme. But I think it's worth noting that in general, these temptations or these afflictions, these various sufferings, whatever they may be, while that may be the pushback, I get a lot of questions from people. One the other day, my husband's coming into the church. He's really excited, but man, he's just feeling like he's all of a sudden having all these issues, and he's depressed and all that kind of he's desolation. I was like, yes, it's more common than you think. Don't worry, push on. They're just trying to get him to stray from the path. Praise God. Pray with them, all these other things. Like, that's the normative means. And whether or not it's heavier for some than others, it is what it is. But that's kind of what I experienced.
Well, I appreciate that. And my daughter and I actually prayed for that individual because you posted it on your Instagram account. So we prayed a Pater Noster. So I was one of them. But I want to just point out before Sam jumps in here is that it was the pursuit of the good, though. And I think that is so important, is that it was your consistent Lectio Divina. It was your consistent pursuit of the good. I didn't hear in what you were saying that you were just looking for those opportunities where Satan was attacking you, right? There wasn't a certain, at least you didn't describe it as any certain paranoia or any sort of, like looking for that, because I feel like that is something that is a temptation of Satan, right? Is that curiosity that he can put on our minds, our hearts, and our thoughts. So anyways, I really appreciate you kind of walking us through that experience, and in doing so, just wanted to point out that that importance of it is for men. It is the harder thing consistently. So anyways, I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I on that note, like, I would you strike me. I haven't known you that long, probably 40 minutes now, but you strike me as like a man of action, like you
Yeah.
said, you go all in on things, like you're very maybe externally active, but like you talk about this period of just really like purification where you were just going inward a lot, both through like therapy, but also like mental prayer, and like you're doing a lot of like inner work. And I think this is something that men struggle with. Like men struggle to go inside. Like out here, like I can manage the world out here, like I can navigate this, I can endure this, like, but man, don't ask me to go inside. Like there's just I don't know what's in there. It's scary. Like, and it kind of, I'm not saying it's 100% easy, but it seems to come easier for women. Like it seems to come easier for women to have that interiority. And so I'm wondering, like you mentioned this prayer corner, which I would recommend to everybody, where you set the atmosphere. But do you have any other like suggestions, things that you learned along the way for guys who are like, man, that all sounds really powerful. Like maybe I need to be praying more. But the idea of just like exploring my interior world, the thought of like praying silently, like that just makes me really uncomfortable. Like, what would you say to a guy who's like really struggling with that call that they're feeling, but also that resistance?
Yeah. So firstly, it's good for men to know that it is going to be harder for you. You mentioned that it's easier for women, and it is. When you look at how our women are, and this isn't a knock on women by any means, it's actually a beautiful thing. The way that women are created, they're created to receive, right? Like that's their very being is reception. Like that's such a beautiful thing. So God uses that for women, and you can have a holy jealousy for that. But for men, we got to understand that we have to work harder. We got to, not to use the motto, but it is the motto, do the harder thing.
Yeah.
Practically speaking, one of the first things I started doing, actually by accident, but it ended up being so effective, and I learned later, through like the Desert Fathers and things like that, but spending a lot of time in silence, which is particularly hard in our current society. But I used to go out on hikes in the woods and purposefully try to get lost. And I wouldn't bring, I'd have my phone if something happened, but I wouldn't bring headphones or anything like that. And I started getting to this habit of just saying like, all right, God, like I'm here. I'm just going to think, but if you want to talk, I'm here to listen, and almost always there ended up being some sort of dialogue of sorts, or I'd be trying to work something out through my head, and there would be some sort of solution or movement or things of that nature. So that's one practical application. The other practical applications, like you mentioned, the prayer corner, having a consistent time is so key. Like when we understand, like one of the most freeing things about helping guys or in helping them break free from pornography is understanding that you have made your body your enemy. It's craving this drug. You've trained it to crave this drug, and you have to untrain it, right? So it's almost similar in prayer, right? So there's aspects of our body, and I'm not saying our body is bad. We're beautifully and wonderfully made, but depending on how you train it can work for you or against you, right? So if I'm getting up inconsistently and I'm praying inconsistently, I'm not going to create that. I'm not going to develop that habit that helps me, that helps my body know that, okay, if I'm getting up at 5:30 every day and I'm going to go sit in this spot, this is going to be my prayer spot. I'm going to light these candles. This is my prayer time. And eventually that helps. It doesn't eliminate all the issues because we're human. We're always going to have distractions and things like that, but it definitely helps. There's times where I play Gregorian chant in the background softly enough to kind of help set that atmosphere of like, this is a holy space. This is a space where I'm trying to enter in with God. There's fantastic prayers out there. There's one, I love Alphonsus Liguori, huge fan of Alphonsus Liguori. He has a means of mental prayer that you can find. It's like a one-page sheet. It's like, this is how you pray when you start. He gives you some guidelines. This is how you pray when you close. You have that sort of thing. So you're setting yourself up, you're training yourself, you're entering into that atmosphere. And even practical application, or more practical than that even, would be a book like The Better Part from Father John Bartunik, who's a good friend of ours, where you have the daily gospel and you have his reflections and you just pray with those. I always recommend that to people who are starting out, because it's like, that's how you do it. Just copy this and insert yourself into it, and have your own thoughts. Those are so big. And then even kind of different branch, but same tree, understanding things like discernment of spirits, really taking every thought captive, knowing not every thought, Teresa of Avila, right? Not every thought in your head is your own, and you shouldn't listen. Okay, well, what does that mean? Not everything that's popping in my head is me. Okay, got to give myself some grace. Let's just put that aside and go back to prayer. Those sorts of things. And that's a tool. Discernment of spirits is a tool that'll help you in all aspects of your life anyway, but even particularly in handling these sorts of things. But yeah, prayer area, consistent time, even if, for goodness sakes, even if it's 15 minutes, if you can just crank out those 15 minutes. And I'll say this, there's a lot. So I went from an extremely grace-filled period where every time I opened the Gospels, it was like I was being poured, graces were just being poured upon me. Since then, my prayer has been the desert. I've been in the desert ever since then. And that's okay. It's okay to be in the desert. And I've gotten to the point where I literally prayed to God one time. I have a huge devotion to Our Lady of Sorrows. So I prayed one time because I was really struggling with focusing and all these other things. I said, okay, agony in the garden. What did you do? What did you ask? Jesus asked his disciples, can you not just stay up with me for an hour? He wants companionship. And I prayed, God, I'll be there. We don't have to talk. We don't have to talk. You don't have to say anything, but I'll be here with you. And that became my commitment to where even if I'm not feeling it, even if I'm in the desert as I have been for so many years, praise God, I'm still showing up and I'm going to be with him on that rock in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I'm just going to be there. And that's the mental prayer. And if something comes. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But I'm living out that relationship. I'm owning that relationship as I would if I was married, that I would with my wife. I'd show up and love her even when I didn't feel like it. Because we all know you love even though you don't feel like it sometimes, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that you're mentioning the relationship of the body, because I'm a therapist myself, and one of the things that is really a growing trend in therapy in general is like somatics, they call it, but it's essentially the relationship of the body and the mind, and how they're so closely intertwined. And there's almost no way you can heal the mind without in some way addressing the body. But you're talking about this idea of like just showing up, like in neuroscience, they have this idea of implicit memory, where it's like you do something long enough, like your house, you walk around your house, you could navigate your house in your sleep. My son does it. He sleepwalks all the time. But like you can just walk around and you're completely unconscious because you know that house like the back of your hand. Like you don't even have to think about it. It's just so ingrained in your body and in that muscle memory that you don't even think about it. And it's kind of, I love what you're saying, is like it's kind of the same thing, applying that principle to your prayer life, your spiritual life, where it's like you do something long enough, even the physical action of sitting in a certain place or kneeling in a certain place, like creates that like implicit memory that's, it's below the radar. You're not, consciously aware of it or thinking about it, but it's your soul's like ready, like it's ready to receive whatever God sends you. So I love that point. I just wanted to highlight that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's maybe one of y'all would know this better than I do, but is it lex orandi, lex credendi, right? Is that the same principle?
Yes.
Yeah. Comes up frequently on our episodes. So I appreciate you mentioning that. I want to talk about do the harder thing. And so, actually, but before we jump in there, it's inspiring. And I appreciate you mentioning the dryness of prayer, right? Because I actually think that that's something that comes by to men often, right? Is this sort of dryness. And I know it myself. And I remember talking to the Catholic Gentlemen Plus members will know, asking a hermit, that same question about, I've got Teresa of Avila's 9 hierarchy, of prayer, like stapled up. When am I going to get past the second or the third rung or whatever,
right.
And he quickly jumped in and just said, pray as you can, not as you can't. Right. And that's what we're called to do. And that St. John of the Cross rings through my head of like, the endurance through the darkness or endurance through desolation, is preparation for great light. And I just, I just see that. And I want to encourage men that are listening to that, because I, like you, Jordan, have had years, of kind of, coming to prayer every single day, and maybe once or twice a year, having kind of like that inspiration and that, but it's not certainly, but I've had periods of my life too, where likewise, where it's like every single month, and I'm just, you know, jumping at prayer and loving it and really, really sensing movements within. But then, 5 kids later, it's like my life has taken a different direction and that dryness has set in. So I appreciate you mentioning that. So coming back, why do the harder thing? Why did you pick that up? I'm hearing this thread of consistency, this thread of stability, this thread of doing what is right, regardless of the outcome or regardless of, the situation, but we're just pursuing the true, good, and beautiful. And I want to hear from you why you chose do the harder thing.
Yeah. So the name is how I came about the name is kind of an interesting story. I'll tell it as quickly as possible, but I'm sure everyone out there has had one of those moments where you're having an argument in your head that has never happened, that may never happen. It's like a preemptive argument, that goofy nonsense where, well, if this happens, I'm going to say this. And if this happens, I'm going to say this, or I should have said that, right? It's the norm. It's another one of those normative temptations. The enemy's going to try to draw you to the past or the future, right? So that's what was happening. But God used it. God permitted it and he used it. And in the midst of that, I remember telling this person that I was arguing with, and again, this argument never happened. This is all in my head. I tell this person, you need to just do the harder thing. And for some reason, and I should mention at the time, like I was actually crying. I was driving and crying while this is going on in my head. Wow. It was just not a good situation, but it snapped me out of it. And I was like, what the heck is that? Do the harder thing. What is that? And so I wrote it down. And as I mentioned, these silent hikes, I'd go on these silent hikes and I was like, okay, do the harder thing. So when there was a fork and there was a path that was more difficult, I chose the more difficult path because I started learning, when you're pursuing what's more difficult, more often than not, you're pursuing a more virtuous path, right? So that became my life motto. Whenever there's a decision that had to be made, especially during that time, I would think, what's the more difficult thing to do? And more often than not, that was the more virtuous option. And that would have been the better option for me to do, and so it just became a thing. So that's why I named it. I named it that. And, funny enough, so I had this thing going for like a year and it was starting to blow up. And I had a good friend who knew about it. And she said, you need to tell your dad about this. And I was like, okay. So I bring it to him and he says 2 things. He says, number one, have you been reading St. John of the Cross? I was like, I'm trying, but it's just so right now I'm struggling with it. Yeah. So he opens up St. John of the Cross and I couldn't remember which book it was, but he just goes in there like he does and goes to the exact page and pulls it. And he almost said, almost verbatim, I think one word was different, but he's exhorting somebody to do the more difficult thing. Wow. Like that was his exhortation, right? So then he says, where did you get the name from? So I tell him the story. Now, he goes, interesting. He said, my grandfather had just passed, I think that year. It was very recent. He said he was very successful. He had a construction company in California. He had like 3 houses in Arizona that he built. One of them was built for his model train sets. Like he was just that kind of eccentric old guy. And so he said, he sits me down and he says, so I wanted to know what made your grandfather successful. So I sat down with him and I interviewed him. I asked him all these questions. And about 3 or 4 hours after we were done, Grandpa Art says, well, I'm sorry, Danny, I don't know if I answered your question. And Dad goes, no, you did. Dad's my age at the time. He goes, no, I think you did. And my grandfather goes, yeah, it all comes down to just doing the harder thing. Wow. And so my dad goes, I think Grandpa Art gave that to you. I was like, I'll take it. Praise God.
Thanks be to God.
So that became the motto and it still is in many ways. And it just kind of encompassed all of these things. If you're trying to overcome sin, by the very nature of overcoming sin and choosing virtue, you are doing the more difficult thing. It's easy to choose sin. Even if it's, even if you're not sinning, you're trying to overcome a vice of anger. Maybe it hasn't raised to that level of sin yet. That's still doing the harder thing, choosing to subject your flesh and your feelings and your emotions to your intellect and will. So it just kind of stuck, and that's where it's still there. So
I love it. Congratulations. No, it's exciting.
Yeah.
That is awesome. I love that. And I think the thing about that is my brother is a pilot and he took me flying recently, and I was like, I just like to overcome the resistance of gravitation, you got to have like a lot of power to like lift you off the ground, because gravity is strong. Like that's what, and it's like sin is like a sort of gravity. And it's like when you try to ascend, there's going to be resistance. There's going to be something trying to like pull you back down, both externally, yes, but like also internally in your own heart, like your own fallen nature is going to be fighting you in that. And so essentially, I love the motto, because if you want to have a spiritual life at all, you're going to have to do something hard, because there's always going to be that resistance. There's always going to be that gravitation trying to pull you back, and down to complacency, down to even sin. And it's like, you just got to, you struggle. It's a struggle to overcome that. And by God's grace, of course, the saints show us it's absolutely possible.
Amen.
But it's also going to feel like a cross for a time. So I love it. Like, and we just encourage everyone who's listening, if you're feeling that resistance, first of all, that's a good thing. That means you're doing something. And second, the saints tell us it's not forever, in the sense that soon, like a new gravity from heaven will start to take over. Once you get past a certain point, there's like it'll actually be harder, I think, to transgress that loving relationship with God than it will be to so it just, all that to say, I love the motto, and I would encourage everybody, when you're feeling that resistance, do the harder thing, and God's grace will meet you there.
Yeah. Amen.
Well, wonderful. Well, Jordan, tell us where we can find things, right? As we wrap up this episode, where can men go? We'll put it in the show notes to learn more about you, what you're doing, stay up to date, and all the happenings of your life.
Yeah, so most of my rants, ramblings, and nonsense is on Instagram. That's do_the_harder thing. There's a website, dotheharderthing.com. I haven't really updated it a lot, but there are some resources on there. The podcast, Do the Harder Thing, which is slowly coming out when I have time. There's a lot of prayers on there right now. I just uploaded recently. But you can find even greater stuff at spiritualdirection.com, who I work on with, all that kind of stuff. Avalanche, dude. If there's any men out there who think they have a calling to the priesthood, check out myhighcalling.com. That's something that we do. I can't push that enough. It's amazing. And then I'll be narrating, or I am narrating, I'm in the process of narrating Dad's new book from Alphonsus Liguori, Finding Peace in the Storm, which is available for pre-order now. And from Sophia Institute Press. And I highly recommend that, because a lot of what I talked about and a lot of what happened in my life is, and I mentioned God's permissive will many times, Liguori hits it out of the park with understanding those sorts of things. So I think that's it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Jordan, just thank you so very much for joining us today. We really are edified, and it's just been an honor to get to know you and connect with you, and you're in our prayers. So just thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
And as we end each of our episodes,
be a man, be a saint.